Today we'll be talking about Chapter 22, Section 1, and that is our nation's sick economy. Now, the 1920s were considered a prosperous time in American history, and however, they concluded with the greatest stock market crash in American history, along with the greatest economic depression in our history. And so how did a time of such prosperity conclude with such a time of despair? And that's what we're going to be looking at today, these severe economic problems. Number one, how does something like this happen? Which is what we'll be exploring in this section. So, notice the title says Economic Troubles on the Horizon. So, what signs of a faltering economy could people look at that time, even in the midst of the roaring 20s, even in the midst of unprecedented economic growth, wage increases generally, better technology, better quality of life, and we even looked at arts and culture because more people had time to enjoy those things. So what is it that causes a depression? Well, first, we have to look at key industries. Some politicians call these the industries that are too big to fail. Things like, today, the automakers or some large banks, that if these things fail, then our economy could possibly collapse. So what key industries were there in the 1920s? Number one, railroads. The transportation infrastructure of our country. If transportation, which was run privately at this time, collapsed, we're going to experience major layoffs. Those industries purchase lots of materials. They create lots of jobs. Lots of other industries rely on the railroads. Same with textiles. Same with steel. Unfortunately, these industries were barely making a profit at that time. Other key industries, mining, not only coal, but raw materials, iron ore, precious metals. Mining in general was experiencing a decline. The lumber industry was experiencing a slower demand. Part of this was due to a decrease in new home construction as a result of key industries. By key industries, I mean the chief employers in our country, the chief purchasers of materials, the chief creators of jobs. When these industries are experiencing hard times, then people are either being laid off or seeing a reduction in hours, and we measure that generally by looking at a lessening of discretionary income. Coal was especially hard hit. New technologies can create troubles in an economy. Now, this is what we call a time of economic readjustment. For example, the new technology of hydroelectric power was proving cost effective. Dams can generate electricity, and it's a renewable form of energy as opposed to coal, where there is a finite amount of coal, and when we run out of coal, no more electricity. And so, since there were new forms of energy being discovered, coal's demand was declining. Yet again, coal is a big employer in many areas, particularly in the mountains, in West Virginia, in eastern Kentucky, even parts of Carolina. The coal industry is big. It's a big employer. And so when the demand goes down, people get laid off. People see a reduction in hours. And again, we can measure that nationwide by looking at the amount of discretionary income. Now, the next piece of an economy that we need to look at are called boom industries. Boom industries are the types of industries that rely on a strong economy. This is the consumer industry, where automobiles, home construction, retail, and consumer items, those are big employers. In fact, you may find yourself working for one of these industries this summer. Consumer industries rely on people to have money to buy things. And that money has to come from a strong economy that's creating jobs, that is creating good enough jobs where people have discretionary income to choose to buy things they want. And the trouble with this is when these do poorly, these do poorly. And as a result of this, things like housing, things like automobile construction, sales and retail begin to decline. Now, an economy of a nation is very complicated. So far, we've reviewed what happens when key industries begin to decline. Had it just been that, perhaps we would not have gone to a Great Depression. But also, the end of the First World War caused a decreased demand for U.S. agricultural products. Nations like Britain and France were no longer relying on agricultural products produced in the United States. And since demand fell and the prices of crops went down, the income of the average American farmer was declining. Now, the trouble with this, especially in the 1920s, is we were still a rural agrarian country. Now, we had already gone through our Industrial Revolution. 40% of Americans were living in urban areas, but a large portion of our country was still living in rural agrarian areas, and many of these Americans were relying on farming as their means of income. And when the price of crops went down, many farmers defaulted on their loans. Many lost their farms entirely. The Wizard of Oz was set during this time. Dorothy's family was about to lose her farm to the bank. They simply could not make enough money. Now, what do you do if you're a desperate farmer and the price of crops has fallen? Your only option is to increase your output to hopefully offset the loss of revenue. This is a dangerous game to play, because when farmers begin to grow more crops and the price of crops are going down, all they're doing is increasing the supply of a product in low demand. And when a supply of a product in low demand continues to grow, the price continues to plummet. And the problem becomes worse. Now, banks at this time were not guaranteed by the Federal Reserve. Laws such as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, laws protecting banks are going to come after. So the trouble with this is banks who relied on investments to farmers, when farmers began to default on these loans, the banks began to fail. This is where things begin to get scary. Now, in the next couple days, today and tomorrow, we'll be looking at how a conservative government responds to an economic crisis like this. Calvin Coolidge, for example, very conservative president, pro-business. He was even the one who said the business of America is business. The government was offering to buy, at least Congress was proposing buying surplus crops from farmers. This would have ensured a small degree of demand. In fact, some proposed in Congress even guaranteeing prices, meaning freezing prices on crops to keep them from falling further. The president actually vetoed what was called the price support bill. And next, since wages in many industries were stagnant, since many people were experiencing layoffs, and also due to increasing credit card debt, which perhaps you remember from the poverty simulation, it can be difficult if you find yourself with a reduced income or a substandard job with a family. It can be difficult to make it through a month without having to borrow money. And so since debt was increasing, our general amount of discretionary income was declining, people have less money to spend. Then much of our economy is based on consumerism. I mean, think about how many products that you buy because you want them. And those companies rely on you buying those products because you want them. And if no one buys those products, they go under. I mean, think about Pepsi. You could live without Pepsi. It tastes good. It's great. You could survive without it. And that could be something if you found yourself without money or a job. You might have to cut Pepsi out of your life. It wouldn't be ideal, but you would survive, and Pepsi would collapse. The scary thing about this is, I mean, there's several different recipes, ingredients that go into making a Great Depression. Your key industry's in trouble, the agricultural sector is in decline, consumer income, discretionary spending on consumer items was going down because of this, and then finally the amount of consumer debt was growing. Many people were having to buy goods on credit. One of your key terms here, of course, that's the simple one, meaning buy now, pay later. The fact that interest rates were low, that businesses were offering easy credit. You could call this even predatory loaning, predatory lending, that is, where businesses were encouraging you to go into debt to get their products, encouraging people to buy things that they could barely afford to make the payments. And so if you find yourself in this situation, you can barely afford to make the payments. What happens if you get laid off? My wife and I are careful with our money, but even still, if one of us got laid off, we might lose our home. We can't default on her student loans. By law, you cannot declare bankruptcy and avoid student loan repayments. We'd have to make those. So we might have to default on our home loan. We do that, we lose our house. The bank sells our home on a short sale. They lose money on the investment, but they would at least get some of it back. So if they have to default on everyone's homes, they could go bankrupt. And that's what was happening in many cases. So people were piling up debt, not just out of greed, not entirely based on stupid decisions, but the amount of consumer debt was growing. And this is scary. Now, when debt increases in your personal life, you have less money to spend on things you want. You have to spend more of your income towards debt repayment. Been there. I know that story too well. And the same goes for national debt. And hopefully, you'll learn to manage that responsibly before you acquire a lot of debt. The point is that people find themselves in this situation. And when consumer debt is on the rise, discretionary spending is on the decline, generally. Next, we find that much of the Roaring '20s was only roaring for certain groups of people. That is the common phrase you've heard, the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. So much of the gross domestic product increase that we saw was for the very wealthy. In fact, 70% of families, even before the Great Depression, were living below the poverty level. So almost a little over 2 out of every 3 Americans earned less than a minimum for a decent standard of living. And so many of these new products that came out simply were not available. We heard about electricity in homes, modern appliances. At this time in the 1920s, my grandmother was young. They were subsistence farmers. They grew everything they needed.
How did the rich get richer?
Good question. So, what that means is, the old phrase of the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. We're talking about an income gap. A gap between, you may have heard of the phrase 1% and the 99%. So many of the economic gains, many of the raises that were being experienced throughout the 1920s were happening to the rich more than the poor. CEOs were giving themselves giant bonuses and huge pay increases while they weren't giving their employees much of anything. So the point is that if a company experiences greater profits, they are not always going to pass down those profits to their employees. If they don't have to, they might not. They probably won't. It depends on the company. And so this is where we get the income gap, is that a company like Standard Oil, owned by John D. Rockefeller, who owned 90% of the oil in the country, well, how do you think that guy got to own 90% of the oil in the country? He paid his workers very poorly. He invested his profits into acquiring more oil companies, through hostile takeovers and mergers, and he didn't pass down the profits to his employees. He kept the profits for himself, and he invested the lion's share back into his company, creating more jobs, but paying his workers substandard rates. Therefore, he became the richest man who ever lived, but his workers were barely making an end. And that was perfectly legal at the time. In fact, you could argue the same is being practiced today. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. So, an extreme, uneven distribution of income is a sign of a very troubled economy. Now, right before the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, former president of the Food Administration during the First World War, ran for president. Once he won the primary and became the Republican candidate for president, he won with an overwhelming majority. You see, these signs of a troubled economy, you can see them if you look. But it's not as simple as just watching the television or, at that time, listening to the radio or even reading the newspaper. It takes looking carefully. You know, it might take reading the Wall Street Journal. It might take, well, in our age, simply doing a little Google research on how is the economy really doing. It's not as simple as just, oh, that president is so-and-so, therefore the economy sucks. It's more complicated than that. But nonetheless, Calvin Coolidge oversaw the Roaring '20s, the unprecedented economic growth at the time. People were generally happy with the Republican Party because they were the party that got to live through the Roaring '20s. And so Hoover was elected in a landslide victory. However, there were signs of a troubled economy. One of these is if we look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The Dow Jones Industrial Average tracks the state of the stock market. Now, a stock is a piece of a company. It's a piece of a company that has gone corporate and is traded publicly on the stock market. So, if one of you, let's say one of you starts a cosmetic business. Well, that's really simple. All you need is a place to cut hair and do cosmetics. It's not that complicated. I mean, you need to know what you're doing, obviously. So you might want to take some classes on cosmetics, but when you're ready, you approach the bank, and the bank will give you a small business loan for a storefront. Put your name on the store, get some permits. Congratulations, you're a business owner. You're not part of the stock market yet, though. You only become a part of the stock market when your company has become successful enough to incorporate and then to go public, meaning that you've made enough money where you are prepared to trade shares of your business on the stock market. And that can go very well for you if you're a successful business. And so the Dow Jones tracks the health of companies that are trading shares publicly. Now, you can get investors, even on the small end of having your little cosmetology business. You can seek investors. You could come to someone you know who has a lot of money and say, would you like to be an investor in my company? They give you an investment. They are buying a portion of your company, and they are entitled to dividends, which is a portion of your profits. But you're not there yet. You're not being traded publicly. But when you are, that's a sign that you've made it. Twitter only went public about 2 years ago, if that tells you anything. So we're looking at the successful, the Walmarts, the Amazons, etc. And so the Dow Jones is tracking the health of these stocks, of these shares, these pieces of these large companies. Now, throughout the 1920s, stocks were rising steadily. That meant that the Walmarts, the Amazons, the Standard Oils, they were growing. They were experiencing significant amounts of growth. And this was a good time to invest in the stock market. So that meant that if you bought shares in Standard Oil or Carnegie Steel or F.W. Woolworths, then those companies were doing well. They were experiencing great profits. You would probably see an increase in the value of those stocks. And after you saw that for long enough, and you have half a brain and some money to invest, it's almost like a sure thing. It's like you buy the stocks, you get dividend checks, and you see the value of your stocks grow exponentially. And this encourages people to go into the stock market. And in fact, stocks were rising so rapidly that many people started to even borrow money to buy stock. That's a scary prospect. It's called buying on a margin. And yes, you can do that. You can borrow money to buy stock. Now, banks engage in this practice. This practice was outlawed through Glass-Steagall. It was a federal law that prohibits banks from engaging in speculative investments. But it was done away with in the 90s, and banks are back to doing it. In fact, that's up for discussion. Some of the candidates are proposing a renewed Glass-Steagall. Anyway, speculation and buying on a margin are pretty scary things. Speculation means you're buying stocks on the hope of a quick profit. People do this for a living. They're called day traders. You can make an income. You can make a good living by watching the stock markets closely and by buying and selling shares quickly. It's a dangerous game, but people are involved in that. It's called speculation. Banks do this all the time. So let's say that one of you wanted to buy a house, and you're kind of sketchy. Your job history is not very reliable. Your grades in school were not very good. You don't have a strong history of being a reliable person. So the bank's going to give you a loan. They're going to say, you know what, we're going to loan you the money you need. We're going to charge you a higher interest rate than we would someone who's more reliable. That's called a subprime loan. That means they are engaging, they are giving you a loan, but they're not real sure about you. So because they're not real sure about you, they're going to charge you a higher interest rate. Subprime loans were one of the biggest causes of the 2008 recession, and were one of the underlying causes of the Great Depression. My point is, it's a house of cards. It's scary. All of these factors that we just discussed are some of the underlying bigger causes of the Great Depression. It wasn't just Black Tuesday. It was all the things that came before. Now, Black Tuesday was September of 1929, when the stock prices finally reached their peak and then began to fall. What economists also look for is signs of a bubble. Research has been done in looking at cities, literally in tracking the size of skyscrapers in looking for bubbles. Is that when companies are growing too quickly and the shares of their stocks are going up too rapidly, that's a sign of what we call a bubble. Now, like any bubble, bubbles can burst. And the bubble burst for the entire stock market here in 1929. It was called Black Tuesday, where the stocks began to plummet. And people watched this closely. And people saw that the value of their stocks were going down dramatically. And again, stocks represent pieces of businesses. And that means that American businesses were declining rapidly for all the reasons we just looked at. And so what do you do as a stockholder? Well, you've got a couple options. If you have other assets, meaning that your financial well-being for the next 10 years is not dependent on the value of those stocks, you can hold on to them. That's called riding out the crash, meaning you don't sell anything. And you'll see an example of this in a clip in just a moment. Your other option is you can try to sell. Try to recoup your losses as quickly as can by selling off as much of the stock as you're able. You know, if I found out one of your businesses was about to go under, but I heard about it or I had a feeling about it before it was going to go under, then I'm going to sell my stock to another one of you. and then I can walk away.
Did any businesses buy out like the other shares that people sold and profit from it in there?
The Kennedy family is one of the most famous. Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the family, not only rode out the Great Depression, he was able to buy up large amounts of stock, and then they became the Kennedy family. But the thing that you get, before you can do that sort of thing, you have to already have enough wealth, as I said, to be able to ride out a depression like this and hold on to those stocks which are virtually worthless, expecting them to rebound. For example, when you go into a job and you get a job with retirement benefits, that's the end goal. You want a job with retirement. Most of your retirements will be based in some part on the stock market. I get a yearly statement from my 401k. It's the retirement. So I'm looking at retiring when I'm in my early 50s. I won't have to teach anymore. I'll do something else, I don't know what. But I'll do something. But I'll be done with teaching. I get a statement every year saying, here's how the stock market's doing. Here's how your retirement's doing. It's either up, it's down, sometimes it's really up, sometimes it's way, way down. I throw it away. I don't even read it. I don't want to know. Because if I watched it closely and I saw it was going down this month, then I might panic and sell. But since I can live without that money until I'm in my 50s, well then I'm not going to touch it. But you see, the trouble is, what does it represent? Now, since all of the stocks were plummeting, that represents all of the businesses for the reasons that we've looked at. And when people tried to sell frantically, many people didn't even want to buy them. That means businesses didn't have the money to continue. They would close their doors. Some people lost everything. And so the stock market crash, known as Black Tuesday, led to the Great Depression, a time when the economy plummeted. Unemployment skyrocketed. It reached the highest level it has yet in our history. It lasted for 11 years. Recessions can last as short a term as 6 months, as long a term as a year. Depressions, we define those as lasting much longer. After this crash, many people panicked. Many tried to take all their money out of the banks. Another word for bank is a trust. In fact, banks are called trust at the larger level. And it relies on a faith relationship between the customer and the bank. You are placing your faith in a bank when you put your money in there, that they will facilitate all your daily transactions. And they do so for free. And we'll learn a little more about that with our next clip. You see, what do banks do with your money? They don't hold on to it. They invest it. They invest it into loans. They invest it into the stock market. And when the stock market failed, many banks began to close. And so many people freaked out, understandably so, and went to the banks and said, I want my money before you close, before it's gone. And so people rushed the banks. During this time, the gross national product, that is the output of our country, the total profits that our country makes, fell by half. Half. Means businesses closed, key industries laid off, tons and tons of workers had to reduce their output, and our entire country's output was reduced by half. 1 out of 4 of Americans were out of work. This peaked at 1 out of every 3 Americans out of work, and it's worse than that. Many of those who had jobs were underemployed, meaning severe reduction in hours and pay. As jobs began to bounce back, many of those were not very good. In fact, that's one of the troubles we've had with our own recovery, is that yes, employment has grown and has begun to bounce back, but the trouble with underemployment is the same trouble they had at that time. Yes?
For the businesses that survived, were a lot of them did a lot of them stay with their original owners, or did a lot of them end up changing ownership because of the crash?
Well, it depends, and in fact, the next clip is a great illustration of that. Many of those folks who had money to invest could buy up these businesses at the lowest prices ever. And with that, they could acquire large empires very cheaply. It's a sad reality. Is that, yes, I mean, with the uneven distribution of wealth, that means there are very few people that have enormous sums of money. And what are they going to do with that money? Well, they want to increase that money. They want to invest. And this is the best time to buy in the stock market when prices are low. And so like he said, this is a good time to buy. And yes, businesses did change hands often.
Don't look now, but there's something funny going on over there at the bank, George. I've never really seen one, but that's got all the earmarks of being a run.
Hey, lady, you got any money in the bank, you better hurry.
George, let's not stop. Let's go.
A minute there. Uh-oh.
Please, let's not stop,
I'll
George.
be back in a minute, Mary.
Well, hello, everybody. Miss Thompson, how are you? Charlie, what's the matter here? Can't you get in?
What is this, Uncle Billy? A holiday?
George.
Come on in, everybody. That's right. Let's come on in. Come on, Jimmy. Now, look, why don't you all sit down? Here, there are a lot of seats over there. Just make yourself at home.
George, can I see you a minute?
Why did you call me?
I just did, but they said you left. This is a pickle, George. This is a pickle.
All right, now, what happened? How did it start?
Well, how does a thing like this ever start? All I know is the bank called our loan.
When?
About an hour ago, I handed over all our cash.
All of it?
Every cent of it, and still was less than we owed them.
Holy mackerel.
And then I got scared, George, and closed the doors.
The whole town's gone crazy.
Yeah, hello? George, it's Potter.
Hello?
George, there is a rumor around town that you've closed your doors. Is that true? Oh, well, I'm very glad to hear that. George, are you all right? Do you need any police?
Police? What for?
Well, mobs get pretty ugly sometimes, you know. George, I am going all out to help in this crisis. I have just guaranteed the bank sufficient funds to meet their needs. They will close up for a week and then reopen.
Just took over the bank.
I may lose a fortune, but I am willing to guarantee your people, too. Just tell them to bring their shares over here, and I will pay 50 cents on the dollar.
Oh, you never miss a trick, do you, Potter? Well, you're gonna miss this one.
If you close your doors before 6 p.m., you will never reopen.
Now, just remember that this thing isn't as black as it appeared. I have some news for you, folks. I was just talking to old man Potter, and he's guaranteed cash payments to the bank. The bank's going to reopen next week.
But, George, I got my money here. Did he guarantee this place?
Well, no, Charlie, I didn't even ask him. We don't need Potter over here.
And I'll take mine now.
No, but you're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Maitland's house, and 100 others. You're lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can. Now, what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
I got $242 in here, and $242 isn't going to break anybody.
Okay, Tom. All right. Here you are. You sign this. You get your money in 60 days.
60 days?
Well, now, that's what you agreed to when you bought your shares.
Tom, did you get your money?
No.
Well, I did. Old man Potter will pay 50 cents on the dollar for every share you got.
50 cents on the dollar?
Yes, cash.
Well, what do you say?
No, Tom, you have to stick to your original agreement. Now, give us 60 days on this
Okay,
thing.
Randall.
Are you going to Potter's?
Better to get half than nothing.
That's what I need.
Tom! Randall, now, Randall, wait a minute. Now, wait. Now, listen. Now, listen to me. I beg of you not to do this thing. If Potter gets a hold of this building and loan, there'll never be another decent house built in this town. He's already got charge of the bank, he's got the bus line, he's got the department stores, and now he's after us. Why? Well, it's very simple. Because we're cutting in on his business, that's why. And because he wants to keep you living in his slums and paying the kind of rent he decides. Joe, you had one of those Potter houses, didn't you? Well, have you forgotten? Have you forgotten what he charged you for that broken-down shack? Here, Ed, you remember last year when things weren't going so well and you couldn't make your payments? Well, you didn't lose your house, did you? You think Potter would have let you keep it? Can't you understand what's happening here? Don't you see what's happening? Potter isn't selling, Potter's buying. And why? Because we're panicky and he's not, that's why. He's picking up some bargain. Now, we can get through this thing all right. We've got to stick together, though. We've got to have faith in each other.
But my husband hasn't worked in over a year, and I need money.
How am I going to live until the bank opens?
I got doctor bills to pay. I need cash.
I can't keep my kids on faith. I've got to have...
How much do you need?
Hey! I got $2,000. Here's $2,000. This will tide us over to the bank reopens. All right, Tom, how much do you need?
$242.
No, Tom, just enough to tide you over until the bank reopens.
I'll take $242.
There you are.
That'll close my account.
Your account's still here. That's a loan. Okay. All right, Ed.
Well, I got $300 here, George.
All right, now, Ed, what'll it take until the bank opens? What do you need?
Well, I suppose $20?
$20. Now you're talking. Thanks, Ed. That's fine. All right, now, Miss Thompson, how much do you want?
But it's your own money,
Now,
George.
never mind about that. How much do you want now?
I can get along with 20, all right.
$20, fine.
And I'll sign the papers.
You don't have to sign anything. I know you. You pay when you can. That's okay. All right, Miss Davis.
Could I have $17.50?
That's your heart. Of course you can have it. You got 50 cents. 7.
We're gonna make it, George.
6.
They'll never close us up today.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Bingo! We made it. Close the door, Eustace. We made it. Look, we're still in business. We still got $2 left. Well, look, let's have some of that. Let's celebrate.
You see, the financial collapse was felt worldwide. What happens in our country affects the rest of the world. The Great Depression limited the United States' ability to import goods from other countries. Countries rely on international trade, and so this affected the economy, particularly of Europe. We also passed the highest protective tariff in American history, called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. And this was to restrict trade with other countries so that Americans would be forced to buy American-made products, so getting Americans back to work. The trouble with this is it spread the Depression and made it worse. Other countries couldn't afford to buy American goods, and so since we weren't buying their goods, they couldn't afford to buy our goods. And this led to increasing unemployment around the world. So just by way of review, the general causes of Great Depression. One, trouble with international trade, partly caused by tariffs. Debts from the First World War. Remember, we spent a ton of money on the First World War. That was another underlying cause of the Great Recession just a few years ago. Problems with the agricultural sector because of the availability of easy credit, high consumer debt, and then finally this income disparity, the fact that much of the economic growth was occurring only at the very top. What did the federal government do at this time? Responded by trying to keep interest rates low so that people would borrow more money. Borrowing more money stimulates the economy. But that was about it. And so we'll look at how the conservative, kind of the Republican response to a depression more tomorrow. So first, let's look at how the Great Depression affected people living in cities. Since larger numbers of Americans were living in cities, first off, unemployment. Unemployment hit 25% right away. Underemployment was a major problem. That means you're working as much as you're able, but you're not able to make enough money to provide for your family. In cities, most people pay rent, especially in downtown areas. Not many people are fortunate enough to own the building they live in. They typically pay rent. But even still, for those who own the dwelling that they stay in, you either can't pay rent or you can't pay your mortgage, both end in eviction, meaning they lost their homes. Where would people go? There were no government safety nets. We're not at a point where there is unemployment, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. These things don't exist. Social Security did not even exist at this time. So people had no choice but to find homes where they could, meaning they became homeless, living in shacks called shanty towns. People were reduced to digging through the garbage. As the man in the clip said, you don't know what it's like to have to dig through a garbage bin for food. I hope you don't. And people were reduced to begging. It's a humbling, humiliating experience to go from providing for yourself and the confidence and security that affords to being reduced to beg for a living. With no government safety net, people were required to hope for the kindness of private individuals. Private charities provided some of the only direct relief to those made poor by the Great Depression. Soup kitchens or bread lines funded by private charities could sometimes take all day waiting in a line to receive a meager bowl of soup. Minorities, African Americans and Latinos often experience higher levels of unemployment and lower pay generally. Here's a picture of a shanty that an individual built simply from scraps. This is actually a pretty nice one. Got a stove, got a roof, got walls, and even a window. Most people were living in cardboard boxes or homeless altogether. Now let's look at depression in rural areas. Much of America was still agrarian by the 1920s, meaning that lived on farms in the country in rural areas. How would folks around here have been affected? Well, if your family were already farmers, and if they didn't owe money on their land and home, and they were able to keep their home, well, they might be able to become subsistence farmers, meaning growing enough to survive. That's how my family made it through the Great Depression. Talk to your folks sometime to see how yours made it through. That's easier said than done. My grandmother told stories of her brothers going off to fish all day at a time sometimes, bringing home the fish, eating the ones they could, storing the ones they couldn't, and then doing the same the next day. Or working odd jobs. My grandpa even tried his hand at mining gold. I found his mine when I was a kid. It was really neat. They tried everything. Mining gold. It wasn't very lucrative, so he went to work in a copper mine in Copper Basin, which is just past Murphy. He tried his hand at lumber, cutting wood for a living, one of the more dangerous occupations. Worked for the TVA, building dams. Worked for anything and everything. And then after the war, the GI Bill allowed him to go back to school, and he became a teacher. But not before he had tried his hand at everything to provide for his family, because there was no safety net. It's make it or don't. Unfortunately, about 400,000 farmers lost their homes due to foreclosure. Not everyone was as lucky as my family to have their property fully paid for. Out west, what we call the bread belt, so many farmers had either been evicted, leaving their land fallow or unplanted, or had exhausted the soil in the land from overproduction. Remember, when the price of crops fell, those who were in farming as a business tried boosting production, ending crop rotation, putting as much soil to use as possible. And the side effect of that was that exhausted land cannot produce anything. And this was happening on such a large scale, coupled with a drought through the 1930s, that farms were turning to deserts during a time known as the Dust Bowl. And we'll look at a clip of this in just a moment. The Dust Bowl was an area all the way from North Dakota down to Texas, through the Great Plains and one of the drier parts of our country. This area was hardest hit, though it was said that the clouds from the Dust Bowl could be seen as far as the East Coast. We're lucky to live in an area with a large amount of rainfall, but if you've noticed the drought in California, even with our modern technology, parts of California have been returned to desert. Looking at a few images of the Dust Bowl here. See the area most heavily affected. By the way, this would be a good example of a photo essay where we're looking at pictures. You could put some music to it too, but you would still need to narrate. Here we're looking at dried up farms. You're looking at irrigation practices. Here you see a dust cloud. Maybe this one's moving a little too fast because I don't have time to discuss all of it. But, you see farmers using various techniques. This would be like subjects of Steinbeck's novel. Many people just simply had to leave their homes. We'll talk about Roosevelt later and his efforts to help overcome the Depression. But take a look at this. You see the Dust Bowl has even buried homes, and here in this case a tractor. People were calling this a natural disaster at one of the worst times possible. Of course, you see, it affected everyone. Now, John Steinbeck wrote his famous Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, East of Eden. All of these books of his were written about families, individuals. You see, America is not just the story of these powerful white people. It's the story of everyone. And those most severely affected by this depression, by these events, were the average Americans. See here another farm. It looks like they've plowed it recently. To overcome droughts. Farmers would attempt various things, but the unfortunate reality is so many lost their farms entirely. So next, I wanted to show you just one more photograph of the effects of this. You see that the sand has piled up. What was once a farm is now a desert, and that home is in the process of being buried. Now, how did this affect the average American family? So for most, a family is a source of strength. Now, I have to generalize here, because I can't just say that all Americans are heroes, all Americans endured hardship, and all became better people as a result, because that's not true. Sadly, there were many stories of husbands leaving their homes, family members committing suicide, breaking apart under the strain, children leaving because there's simply not enough food to go around, and people being forced to accept the charity of others. Making ends meet can be a great source of stress. You see, we have this culture. Hoover called it rugged individualism. We pride ourselves on our work ethic. We learn the value of hard work from a very young age. And we extol that virtue. And self-sufficiency is something we strive for. And we even look down on those who are too lazy to help themselves. However, it's a different matter when you take a generation of people who believe in those virtues, who are unable to provide for their family, trying everything possible, like my grandpa, like I'm sure your ancestors, tried everything possible to make money to simply put the food on the table. And then imagine you find yourself in that position. How stressful that would be. It's a humbling thing to have to ask for help. To say, I can't do it on my own. Many people weren't willing. Some people, in fact, left their families because they were too prideful to be reduced to begging. About 300,000, mostly young men, took to the rails, became hobos, traveled for a living. There was no federal system of direct relief. You know, today, if one of your parents were laid off, they could at least count on unemployment for a period of time. They could at least hope for some type of relief, Social Security. You could at least apply for health care so you know that if you get sick, it'll be taken care of. There are programs to help you when these things happen. Of course, the intention of these programs is they are meant to be temporary. But at this time, there were no programs. There was no system of direct relief. And so now I want to look at this photograph. Another example of your photo essay. You've got two young men here. I don't know their names. I don't know where this photograph was taken. But we can learn a lot simply by looking at a picture. We can see they're young. I would estimate 12 or younger. We can see there are no parents around. We can see they're walking. They've either just gotten off the train or they're about to try to sneak on. It looks like they're carrying a small amount of food, so I would believe they've been doing this for quite some time. I don't know the name of the photographer, the person who took the photo, though I can tell you they were probably employed by the Works Progress Administration. The New Deal created opportunities for journalists, for teachers, for workers of all trades. And they hired photojournalists to travel the country and document the poverty and suffering. And so I imagine someone took a photograph of these two young men. However, that's probably all they got. Because with no federal system of direct relief, these two young men were forced to travel. Now, what would they do? Where would they go? Well, number one, traveling by train is dangerous. Railroads hire people called bulls. It's the job of the bull to kick you off the train and give you a good solid beating if they catch you. And if they see you again, they might do something worse. It's railroad security. Secondly, you've got to travel with people that you wouldn't obviously choose to travel with. Sometimes hobos were in danger from one another. There's a famous case called the Scottsboro case where a young woman was raped on a train, or at least she claimed she was. It resulted in a huge case, and 8 men spent the rest of their lives in jail accused of rape. It's an interesting case because no proof was ever found of anything, and nonetheless these men spent their lives in jail. We don't really know exactly the details, but the point of it is these 8 young men and the 2 women were all traveling together on a train. So even women were sometimes forced to live on the rails. We don't know how long these young men have been on the rails, but we do know that hobos would develop a system for figuring out where it would be safe to get a warm night's sleep, whose homes would provide them with a meal. But now, if you find yourself in this situation where you suddenly have very little, then you have to budget carefully. You have very limited resources. Many women would sew clothing to attempt to sell it, but also to provide for their families. Many families would grow food and store it. Many canned their own food. Many women went to work outside the home, and we're not really talking about a step towards civil rights here or equality. We're talking about necessity. But the point is that there were many people, proud people, who wanted to earn a living for their families, who were unable to because there were not opportunities available. Sadly, hardship affects children most severely. It's important for everyone to have a good nutritional balance and eat well every day. It's especially important for children. Growing and developing, it's not possible without a healthy, balanced diet. Malnutrition can lead to serious health effects, not only in everyone in general, but for children. Did you know that the average height of the average American during this time was much shorter? Did you know the average life expectancy was much lower? Did you know that many schools closed entirely during the Great Depression? With a lack of tax revenue, they had to close their doors. And as I said previously, many children left home entirely. There just wasn't enough food to provide for them. I'd like to tell you that everyone was heroic and everyone worked hard and everyone pulled together. That's just not the American story, because we have to look at this more generally. Suicide rates went up by 1/3. Admissions to mental hospitals tripled. Some people broke apart under the strain. Generally, people had to give up on things like health care and live with illnesses that were either preventable or treatable. Most people put off college. Many even put off having children. If you've lived through hardship and poverty, it affects you. You develop habits of frugality. You learn to live on limited resources, and you learn to appreciate what you have when it's taken from you. Though there are many sad stories of suicides, there are many good stories as well. For example, I've talked to folks who lived through this time who can tell me of leaving food for travelers. Many stories from hobos of safe places and families that would give you a warm night's sleep. Countless stories of families who would provide work for people passing through. In fact, Steinbeck's book of Mice and Men talks about two young travelers who would go from farm to farm looking for work, and that's how they made their living during this time. So today we'll be talking about chapter 22, section 3, and that is Hoover Struggles with the Great Depression. President Herbert Hoover was a textbook conservative, especially in the way that he handled the Great Depression. And though this is straight from the textbook of a small government approach to an economic crisis, it drew large criticism from most Americans, leading to a major political overturn. You could call it an upheaval, you could call it a political revolution. Nonetheless, it's a huge turnover where the Democrats took control of the House during his administration. FDR was elected. We go from an extreme conservative response to an extreme liberal response. And so let's look at the two approaches. We'll start with conservative today. First off, Herbert Hoover told the Americans that our economy was on sound footing, that depressions, recessions, and boom cycles are part of the natural flow of an economy. This has been evidenced with the burst of the tech bubble in the early 2000s, when the dot-com era came to an end. It could be looked at by seeing the steady incline or steady increase of our economy through the 90s. It could be evidenced by the roaring 20s, by the steady growth of wages, by the steady growth of gross domestic product, and then the decline. And so he, citing economists, would point out this is natural. And he believed, as did the Republican Party, that it was not the purpose of the government to meddle in the economy. In fact, Calvin Coolidge said it well: the business of America is business. That a government exists not to control an economy, but to foster cooperation between competing groups. Meaning, it is private business, privately regulated, free market, unhindered by government regulation. That's conservative economics. That when it comes to the social welfare of the people themselves, the conservatives believe that people should take care of their own families and not be reliant on the government. Classic example, in Mississippi, when they experienced a great flood in the 1920s, a great flood, the equivalent of Katrina, New Orleans underwater, people displaced, homes destroyed. Calvin Coolidge, what did he tell them? Forget it. It is not the government's job. In fact, he said, and I quote, "The government is not an insurance broker to the poor." He believed it was not the government's job to bail them out. And we're going to look at other examples of that related to the Great Depression today. He called it rugged individualism. That you stand or you fall on your own merit. So he took pride in that. And again, this is conservative economic theory still today. That you stand or fall on your own merit. And that's one way of looking at things. So what does this mean practically? So Hoover took very cautious steps in approaching the economic crisis our country was facing. For one, he called a meeting of business and banking and labor leaders to sit down together and discuss and attempt to solve these problems. He believed it was the government's job to facilitate conversation, facilitate community involvement with private entities. He created, in fact, an organization for private groups to raise charitable funds to help people. So he's not looking at this from a cold-hearted perspective saying, "Oh, you're starving, well, that sucks to be you." He's simply saying it is not outlined in the Constitution that the government should take an active role in the social welfare of its own citizens. And to be fair, if you look at the preamble, that's not one of the 6 outlined purposes of our government, according to the preamble. So that's where he's basing that theory. And so he created an organization to foster private cooperation in helping alleviate the suffering of American people. One of his great successes in this facet is Boulder Dam, more popularly known as Hoover Dam. It was named after him because of his enormous success. The amazing thing about this dam, it was the largest dam in the world for its time, generates a large amount of electricity, holds in reservoir scarce water resources in an arid region, controlling flooding, but also distributing water to a place that would be desert otherwise. There would be no Las Vegas without Hoover Dam. But what's amazing about it is he was able to do this without spending taxpayer dollars. Hoover Dam was built through private investment, and Hoover facilitated that private investment. It created thousands of jobs, generates lots of revenue, and is today still an important control of that precious resource in an arid region. Provides electricity enough to power Las Vegas, provides flood control, and then finally water to places that desperately need it.
Frank Crowe is driving ahead the building of the Hoover Dam, the biggest engineering project America has ever seen. He's driving his men hard. The crews work day and night. A sea of concrete rises in the canyon as broad as 2 football fields laid end to end. 5,000 men, 50,000 machines and tools, the best engineers alive, enough material to fill a train over 1,500 kilometers long. This is the 1930s equivalent of putting a man on the moon. Almost 6 million tons of concrete have to be poured. That's enough to lay a meter-wide pavement around the world. But how do you pour that much concrete and get it where it's needed? Frank Crowe designs the most sophisticated cable system ever built. Giant bottom-opening buckets. They pour the concrete into molds, exactly where it's wanted. Concrete was invented by the Romans 2,000 years ago. But the Hoover Dam is the first large concrete dam in history. Today, virtually all dams are made of concrete. It's malleable and it's strong. It's the world's favorite building material for any structure. Frank is up against the clock, and he has a big problem. The drying concrete generates heat. If the dam were constructed in a single continuous pour, it would put out enough heat to bake 500,000 loaves of bread every day for 3 years. But worse, the dam would take 125 years to harden. Frank Crowe's got no time for that.
Backs against the wall, we figured out who we were. We worked our way out of that depression.
The secret of cooling the concrete lies within the dam itself. 937 kilometers of 2.5 centimeter pipe carry ice-cold water from the very river the dam is taming.
No one had ever thought of this before, and those pipes are still in the Hoover Dam today.
Frank Hurry Up Crowe lives up to his name. The Hoover Dam is completed on September 30th, 1935, 2 years ahead of schedule. Frank receives a bonus worth over $4 million in today's money.
For those workers to have built something as monumental and as challenging as Hoover Dam was an astonishing feat of construction. And I think it gave us all a sense of the possible.
It's 1936, and the Hoover Dam is the largest hydroelectric power producing facility in the world. Each of the 17 generators weighs more than 4 jumbo jets. Together, they can supply power to 750,000 people in booming cities like Los Angeles. The dam creates Lake Mead. At over 600 square kilometers, it is the biggest reservoir in America. It helps California produce more food for America than any other state. The Hoover Dam workers make something else boom as well. A little town 50 kilometers away where they go to drink and gamble. Its name, Las Vegas. As the wife of one Hoover Dam worker puts it,
when men worked in such dangerous surroundings, you couldn't blame a lot of fellows for sort of letting their hair down. They were having fun.
In 1930, just 5,000 people live in Las Vegas. Then the dam workers arrive. Then the tourists arrive. Then the gambling. Now over 37 million people come every year to party in Las Vegas. After 70 years, the Hoover Dam still supplies power to the states of Nevada, Arizona, and California. One Las Vegas hotel has the biggest flashlight on Earth. 40 billion candle power. You can read a newspaper 16 kilometers out in space by its light.
So, the Hoover Dam, one of the great successes.
How many people died during the building?
I have no idea how many people died during the building of the dam. I imagine several would have. For example, quite a few folks died in the digging of the Panama Canal, mainly because in a tropical area, malaria is a huge concern. Yellow fever, cholera, things you have to deal with in tropical areas. Around on the Colorado River where this is built, you're dealing with desert conditions, and that creates its own logistical challenges. Number one, how to get enough potable water to the workers, how to deal with droughts, dust storms. But I don't know, so you may want to look that up and let us know. Hoover Dam is one of those great successes in that he was able to do this through private investment. But unfortunately, that's not enough. The building of the dam created hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs. But that's not enough. We're dealing with 25% of Americans out of work. Those who had jobs were underemployed. And as economic problems increased, people turned against the Republican Party. The party that they had supported through the boom times of the 1920s was now blamed for the economic problems facing our country. The Democrats took control of the House in the midterm elections in 1930. The Republicans managed to hold on to a one-vote majority in the Senate. So enough to prevent a two-thirds supermajority, but not enough to get anything done. And so when you see this type of situation, which is what we have now, where the legislative and the executive are controlled by two different parties, it can result in what's called a lame duck Congress, where nothing gets done. And that's the situation we're in now. Meanwhile, farmers have been beset by falling crop prices. Farmer cooperatives around the nation agreed to create artificial food shortages to raise the price of crops. The irony here that John Steinbeck points out in Grapes of Wrath is that farmers were literally dumping crops into rivers, and guards were posted to keep people from stealing them. And so there were real situations where food was being destroyed while people were starving, which Steinbeck points out is pretty messed up. Meanwhile, people are homeless. 300,000 hobos, millions more have been displaced. And so people started calling their shanty towns Hoovervilles in criticism of the president. There are a few examples of the conservatives taking direct action here. No conservative is purely, only, ever conservative. Same with liberals. There's no purist in these regards. People have to be willing to compromise. Small government people have to be willing to take direct action in some circumstances. So Hoover was able to negotiate agreements among private entities. That was one of his big successes. He supported private organizations like the Federal Farm Board. That was a group of farming collectives. And they agreed to buy up excess crops as a group and to hold them until market prices rose. He was able to get large banks, private large banks, to establish a national credit corporation. That is for large banks to merge, to pool resources, etc. But next, the direct action I was speaking of. Two examples of this are the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which lowered mortgage rates, trying to encourage people to buy new homes to bolster the home construction and real estate market. Also, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This was created to provide emergency funds for businesses, to keep private businesses afloat by providing emergency loans. So these were two examples of direct action taken by the Republican president. The trouble with this, and where people distance themselves from the Republican Party politically, is we're dealing with a crisis, an economic crisis. And what we have to remember is what else is going on around the world, is that this depression is being felt around the world. We're lucky that we're a nation rich in resources. We're lucky that we were a wealthy enough nation to be able to create programs like the New Deal, offering millions of jobs, rebuilding infrastructure. Some countries collapsed. Germany turned to fascism, so did Italy. Russia's experiencing civil wars in its transition to communism. Places around the world are collapsing. In fact, immediately following the Second World War, we would be bailing out a number of countries, including Greece and Turkey, that were on the verge of complete collapse of their economic system. So we're lucky that we're a nation rich in resources. Everyone else was not so lucky. But even though we came out of this okay, that was 11 years after the crash. 11 years of suffering, 11 years of 25% unemployment. So how do we address it? The point that the American public discovered is small government wasn't working. Another tragic example is the story of the Bonus Army. World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C. in 1932, asking for the President's support of the Patman Bill. The Patman Bill was going to provide immediate payment for bonuses that had been promised to veterans of the First World War. The Republican-controlled Senate voted down the bill that the House had introduced. The President opposed the bill, and so he made it clear it wasn't going to get past his desk. And then he told the veterans to leave. However, about 2,000 stayed, demanding to speak with Hoover himself. The President sent out the U.S. Army to disband the Bonus Army. He sent American troops against aging veterans. Tear gas was fired into the crowd, injuring men, women, and children. I'm going to show you footage of this. Someday when you get to go to D.C., and you stand at the Lincoln Memorial, you'll think about Martin Luther King and his famous I Have a Dream speech. And it's one of those wonderful moments when you get to stand there and think about that. But I want you to also think about all of these other dark times. I want you to think of the Bonus Army and the fact that there was a time in American history where veterans asked our government to treat them with decency, and the President responded by calling troops and shooting tear gas into a peaceful crowd of veteran protesters, demanding fair payment for what had been promised to them.
In 1932, Washington was under siege. The capital was surrounded by over 10,000 unemployed veterans of World War I from all over the country. Their only assets were the bonus certificates they'd been given after the war, which promised a cash bonus sometime in the future. They needed it now.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945.
What's it that brought you to Washington?
Well, to beat the Undertaker, spend the money before the Undertaker gets it.
I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me, this is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism.
President Hoover was left to deal with the veterans when the Senate rejected their demands. The marchers had stayed, camped out in central Washington.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865.
I knew something was going to happen, that they might be attacked. And I had a press card, so I passed the police lines, and then I saw the soldiers advancing into the camp. And when confronted with this, the men all stood there and said, "Stand firm as long as you can." And they started throwing tear gas. I'd never seen anything like it. They systematically went down the line, burned up all the tents and all the possessions of the people there. I was thinking of Herbert Hoover when this happened, because his election was in 3 months. I thought this would be the finish of Hoover.
The orders of the president must be obeyed. And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army. In the shadow of the beautiful dome of the Capitol of the United States of America.